Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning into the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of Anesthesia and Pain Management Success. Today is a very exciting day because I'm talking with two of the foremost experts who are going to explain to us what's going on with the specialty of anesthesiology. It's a complex, multifactorial landscape with regards to staffing, reimbursement, operational considerations, new sites opening up, demographic shifts, retiring, burnout of current clinicians, etc. And we're going to try to tackle as much of this as possible. I have with us today Dr. Joshua Miller, who has over 30 years of clinical, operational, and executive expertise in anesthesiology and pain medicine. He's currently the chair of the board and physician managing director at Surgical Directions. And Dr. Mo Azam is the head of innovation at US Anesthesia Partners, where he is one of those people sort of at the top of the mast, looking at the horizon, trying to see what are the questions that we should be aware of in addressing today. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's great.
For starters, I know that both of you put in some time to prepare for this conversation. So I'm curious, as you are looking at the data, as you're reviewing the sort of the key sources of like industry publications and numbers that are indicating what is the health and the state of the specialty and where are things headed with all these different facets that I just mentioned, what numbers pop out to you?
Well, I'll kick off. I think overall I describe it as a hellscape. I think many of our peers would likewise consider that. There's been tremendous turmoil, upheaval, right, in the post-COVID environment. And the numbers that pop out to me are the dramatic shifts in demographics, turnovers from hospitals in terms of RFPs and wanting to look at options for different anesthesia coverage. Workforce numbers in terms of salaries and shortages or perceived shortages. And we'll get into, I think, some of those nuances in the conversation here. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, I think, I'm fortunate to be able to sit with a lot of hospital CEOs at a variety of meetings that as sort of nonpartisan physician, I hear their pain points. They're concerned about anesthesiology, but it's becoming more of a global problem. They have a lot of payer pressures, which is also specific, obviously, to anesthesiology in a very unique way. But radiology is a step behind it. So this is not, as we look at the landscape and we talk about anesthesiology, there's a really larger question about how payment and reimbursement is going to move forward. It does come back to, as Mo said, there was really a dramatic shift if you look at all the data around 2019, 2020. The average age of an anesthesiologist is 53. A lot of people in both CRNAs and anesthesiologists around COVID said, I'm done, I'm out. The baby boomer bubble, the final baby boomers are turning 65 in the next couple of years. The impact on Medicare reimbursements versus private insurance. Those are the big pain points. It's interesting. I'm also talking a lot more. The COOs are worried about some of the operational stuff. The CFOs are very much more involved in the conversations we're having.
I'm curious, as you're having those C-suite conversations, do you think, what are the things on the C-suite's minds and how well do you feel? Obviously, you're like boots on the ground in the trenches. You understand the specialty intimately. How well do you feel like hospital administration sort of apprehends these forces, and what are the things where you feel like they've got it on lockdown, and where does there tend to be a gap where you're having to help them, get up to speed on how to address these challenges?
One of the first things I will say, and it's just to open their eyes about the cost associated with the operating room is, if you want to fly from JFK to Heathrow, first class, round trip, it's about $5 a minute. If you just look on one of the airline websites, $5 a minute, and you say, gosh, that's expensive. Well, as we continue to look at both labor and non-labor costs in the operating room, It's now hovering around 75 and moving even more towards $80 a minute. So I reinforce to them that they have to get the costs. It's going to be hard for them to manage costs because labor costs are rising. Inflation rate is rising. So, hardware, et cetera, the costs are rising. But how do we improve efficiencies in the operating room and beyond the operating room when we're talking about anesthesiology services? How are we integrating all of our sites so that we're maximizing the utilization of our anesthesiology personnel?
What a great analogy, right? And the funny thing is, they want to buy the first hour of that flight and then somewhere in the middle, and then the add-on case at the end, and they don't want to buy the whole flight. And so that's not going to work in this model going forward, right?
Well, and particularly again with the downward pressure, and we've seen it over the last several weeks, where several of the large insurance companies are saying, well, we're no longer going to recognize ASA classifications. And for the physicians and others on this call, you recognize that preparing for an ASA 3 or 4 bleeding craniotomy is different than preparing for an ASA 1 carpal tunnel release. So that's as far as intensity, manpower, usage, et cetera. And that's going to be a huge problem, trying to limit total number of minutes for surgery. Anesthesiologists have no control over that, right? And often the surgeons don't have control over that. So these are the kind of pressures that we're seeing as a specialty, but our hospital partners are seeing that as well.
I know another stakeholder here is the private groups to the extent that the model is a private group contracting with the site. So, Dr. Azam, for your conversations that you've had, I know with many industry leaders and group leaders nationally, what have you seen in terms of from the practice side of things, the coordination of, providing sort of the perioperative help in the hospitals, building relationships with the C-suite? What are the groups that are succeeding doing to help address these challenges?
A great question. And, I think the way Josh and I were thinking about this is there's 4 or 5 big headwinds happening all at the same time, creating this perfect storm. So the labor issues, cost inflation, um, uh, salaries for CRNAs are $100,000 higher today than they were when I started. And then, yeah, certainly the demand for work-life balance. You don't to work 60, 70 hours a week anymore. So you need more folks. That is completely related to the diminished anesthesia utilization that's occurred over the last 5 years or so. And these hospitals, in a desperate attempt to maintain financial viability, which is largely driven off of the operating room, will do anything to open a room to attract a surgeon to bring a case.
Mhm.
And if that means putting out the red carpet for a spine surgeon or a high contribution margin service line like that, or opening up entirely new service lines in sometimes difficult to cover locations like cardiology suites, EPS, radiology, and so forth. And when they open those in their financial ledger, there's profit there.
Mhm.
They're not accounting in the labor costs, the physician costs, the anesthesia coverage costs on the outside group. They're only accounting in their employed nurses and so forth and that. So labor crisis, diminished utilization, declining reimbursement, like Josh mentioned, payer behavior, CMS cuts, these little nicks and paper cuts that death by 1,000 paper cuts is occurring, right? The QZ issue of not wanting to reimburse fully for that model, time issues, ASA classification issues. And then to your point, then how does the independent group try to stay solvent in that environment? Ultimately, they go to the hospital for a subsidy and a support. And oftentimes they wait too long to have those difficult conversations. And I think there's a leadership gap. I think folks like Josh and myself have a fortunate opportunity to, as you said, stand on the mast and look out but a lot of times the local practices aren't always connecting with what's happening in their environment. They need to honestly be engaged much further in ASA Advanced Practice Management, to understand what's happening to their peers and to be able to respond accordingly. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I would agree. And you know, a lot of places we go where the groups are in trouble, they come back and they're quadrupling their ask. The hospital, as Mo just said, well, we just need to open another room, so let's look at the contract. And nobody's looking at prime time utilization. Nobody's really looking effectively at block utilization. Are we integrating block for all of our anesthesiology sites? And I would also echo many places we go, there's a lack of leadership on the group side. It's difficult. You know, you're working full time, you're managing all that. And then on the side, it's almost a side business with maybe a manager trying to look at how we manage the group effectively. The other thing I would add is if it's depending on the group size, it's often difficult for the group to negotiate satisfactory rates with insurers. So it helps if with the size and scope of the practice, you have pediatric cardiac anesthesiologists, it makes it easier to negotiate that. That and also sort of flows into what, you know, the large complex hospitals versus rural hospitals, what's going on there. It's a completely different landscape. And that's the reason we're having a lot of trouble in smaller safety net hospitals, frankly.
I pulled a few slides prepare for some of this conversation. If I might show
Please.
exactly on that topic, I think it illustrates Josh's point very well. Is that shown okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So this is from the ECG management consultants, also brought in by a lot of hospitals, and it shows that shortfall in anesthesia um, collections, the labor costs, and then the delta. And what's happened, I think, is in that red, as that's grown and grown and grown, a lot of groups were really reticent to go to their hospitals for fear that they might be RFP'd or offered to be employed. Um, and they kind of held back or didn't have the right clauses in their current contracts to provide for the right escalators as these deltas grew. So they held back and held back and held back. And then when they went to the hospital, their shortfall was so substantial, as Josh says, their ask is shocking to some of these administrators. And it's really interesting. Many of these administrators are certainly not looking standing on the mast and looking at the anesthesia landscape. They're standing on the mast looking at their hospital landscape. So then when they're faced with a massive increase in a subsidy request by a practice on anesthesia, their instinct is to say, this can't be right. Let's go check the market. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you know, we are just inundated with calls from both groups and hospitals. It's you know, doubling easily year over year. And the big question we get from the hospital is we went from $1 million subsidy to now they're saying $10 million. How can that possibly be? And we and the knee jerk is, well, we need to RFP, we need to employ, and we remind the hospitals we have to look at the pros and cons of what that will look like. You know, employing, as an example, recently we were with a large system out on the West Coast, and we built of what it would take, and it's, you know, 125 steps, and they don't have the expertise. It's been my experience as well. The hospitals don't have that leadership on the business side because anesthesiology is a completely different beast than, say, employing your internists. And so those are the questions that we're asked a lot is, okay, we understand the demographic change, the payer pressures, the decreasing supply of both CRNAs and anesthesiologists. We're trying to understand what the best model is, and often it's going to be more expensive or equally expensive. I certainly say when I'm meeting with these hospital leaders and they're dead set on making a change that they can expect a increase in costs of 25% at least for the first year.
This is really interesting stuff, right? Because when we started in clinical practice, Josh and I, I think you were probably in the era where coming out of residency, there was supposed to be a glut of anesthesiologists, right? And I remember some of my partners a little bit older than me were offered a 5-year track,
Mhm,
$100,000 salary,
mhm.
no guarantee to being partner in that era in the 90s.
Right. So yeah, so my first year was 1990, $125,000, no guarantee. And everybody was predicting, and the ACGME actually decreased residency slots through the 90s, which precipitated a lot of where we are now. Because if you look at the generational shift, and now that larger group is now in their 60s and retiring, and there is a downward pressure on slots. So yeah, so that's a big part of it. But Mo, also, I grew up in the era of halothane and succinylcholine. So
We're going to take this back, Justin, to a little bit of talk about back in my day.
that's right.
So that occurred, right? And actually, there was a lot of hospitals that it had independent contractors as anesthesiologists back then. As a matter of fact, my practice in Orlando when I joined had previously been a group of independent contractors. The
Mhm.
hospital had asked them to come under one umbrella. And so then they started to bill under one umbrella and provide call coverage in a consistent fashion under one umbrella. At that time, it was all a reaction against HMOs and payers that wanted to have a unified contract. So they didn't want to contract with 30 anesthesiologists independently at one hospital. They wanted to have a unified contract as well. It's really crazy. One of my partners said he had a 3x5 index card and he wrote his hourly or his unit rate on there, stapled it to the face sheet and the anesthesia record, carbon copy, and sent it to the office. And each anesthesiologist had their own unit rate.
Mhm.
So the health systems wanted better coverage, the payers wanted unified contract negotiations, and these guys all come together under one umbrella. As they do this, they're providing better coverage, they grow, a 10, 15 person group grows to a 30, 40, 50, 60 person group, starts to have CRNAs, starts to cover call increasingly for more complicated cases. They bring on cardiac and expand OB and so forth. And this is a story for all these groups out there, right? Some of them have to pick up trauma and peds and so forth. Now they're hiring specialty folks. And now they're negotiating with payers on something called a usual and customary rate. So they say to the payer, what's the rate that we all should get paid? And the payer says, okay, and they'll pay you. The payers then come up with this system of networks. And the network is to say, you're in our network, you get this rate, or you're not in our network, and then you get your usual and customary rate. Well, networks eventually turn into this crazy beast of out of network and the No Surprises Act. So the No Surprises Act says there's no such thing as an out of network. There's no such thing as a usual and customary rate anymore. You have to be pretty much in their network or take what they're going to give you. And that upends contract negotiations between the groups and the insurers. As those shortfalls continue to occur, No Surprises Act nickeling and diming folks, as all this reimbursement pressure starts to occur, we see an escalation of holding our hands out to the hospital to make up for the delta. And the hospital says, well, if I'm going to pay you that much, I'm going to want to control something. And I think that's what's happened in this interesting pendulum swing from independent guys to groups to contracting with payers to that falling apart. And I'd love to hear Josh's comments on back to the independent guys world because it's occurring out there with locums and what's happening here with this employment world because the hospitals didn't want to really do this in the beginning. Otherwise, they would have offered that.
Right. And I think so. An important part of the discussion when we're looking at all of this is transparency. So often and traditionally, the groups have said, no, we don't want the hospital to really know our unit rate, our blended rate, what our rates are for Blue Cross or whatever. And so the hospital doesn't really know, and they're trying to reverse engineer based on what they're doing in the operating room. What is the group actually bringing in? And so there's traditionally, or at least in the last 10, 15 years, there's been this on the physician side, we're uncomfortable giving the hospital that information because we think somehow it's going to be used against us. The hospital saying, we don't believe the group's data, and we think they're making X, and they're telling us they're bringing in Y. So I'm seeing more financial transparency because that's the only way these contracts can get done. But again, to answer Mo's question, the costs are going up because physicians are saying, given the current uh, manpower shortage, both CRNAs and anesthesiologists are saying we can go work at an ASC 3 days a week and make as much money independently as a 1099 than we will make working as a partner in a group taking calls. So there is a move towards that. I would say, at least on the nursing side, not the CRNA, but nursing side, we're seeing less travelers in the last 2 years or so. The difference is we can't produce enough CRNAs and doctors, and probably for at least 10 years based on the utilization. Procedures are increasing, the complexity of procedures, the types of procedures, things that we're doing now in the cath lab, we didn't do 20 years ago.
Based on the utilization, right? And I just had a blurb, I think it was in Publish and Becker's this week. Um, Gosh, I think even in my practice, a relatively large group in Central Florida, cover 8+ hospitals, quaternary care. Um, Even at our best divisions, 65% utilization. So that New York to Heathrow pilot, right, isn't working a third of the time, but you need to buy him for the whole flight. And so there's not revenue generation there. And I think that's an interesting one. The other one that I think Josh mentioned, and just to flip back to the slide that we had talked about, is the ASA publishes this, right? It's their conversion factor survey. And across every geography, every state, and the metropolitan area, there's a huge spread. So some groups are getting $45 a unit, and somebody's out there getting $150 a unit. And they've all got their hands out to the hospital for a variety of reasons, efficiency, labor costs, et cetera. And the hospitals wants transparency around that if they're going to be writing a big check, right?
Hmm. If we could go back to the No Surprises Act for a minute, which Dr. Azam mentioned, I'm curious to understand. There was some, I think, promises made, or at least ideas about here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what we think is going to happen when we roll out this NSA program to be able to protect patients, which is sort of the billing, protect patients from the surprise medical bill, and remove them from sort of the hostage situation between payers and hospitals and doctors. How have you observed this unfold over the last few years? Has it been working the way that it was originally designed? And what's the functional impact for the specialty?
Oh, a great question. And so, look, there was abusive practices, no doubt, right? There was groups out there, anesthesia, radiology, ED, others, hospitals, surgery centers that deliberately, uh, intentionally ran an out-of-network business.
Mhm.
Why contract with payers when we know they're not going to pay us, and it's really painful to do those negotiations? And I go back to my usual and customary, but then they even jacked that up, right? They asked for exorbitant amounts and they did it regularly. Now the stories out there are pretty significant if you're a patient, right? You go in and have a surgery, the surgeon's got a PA or an assistant that they've billed separately out of network, and you're layered on with this huge bill. You go to the ED and you have a CT done, but the radiologist is out of network. You don't have a choice in that, and you have an enormous bill in that process. And so taking the patients out of the middle is the right thing to do. Disempowering clinicians in their negotiations with the payers was the wrong thing to do. And so they set up this mechanism saying that if that were to happen and there's disagreement, you've got this mechanism to arbitrate. You file what you think should your appropriate rate is, and the payer will put theirs in, and an arbiter will decide, and they'll look at prior contracted rates and make sure no one's asking for something abusive or egregious. They'll look at the quality being furnished by that clinician. They'll look at the case complexity. Is that the carpal tunnel, like Josh mentioned, or is it that aneurysm in the middle of the night? And overwhelmingly, the arbiters are saying the providers are providing the right and appropriate justification and awarding them more than 80% of the wins in some of the larger practices that have set up infrastructure to fight this fairly by providing all the evidence to support their claims in each filing and even automate those filings. They're winning at a higher than 90% rate.
Hmm.
And what are the payers doing? Not paying.
Right.
There's no mechanism in the law that says they have to pay. That's a huge miss when they crafted that law. And there's no mechanism to have transparency on the payer side to show evidence of why what they're offering is legitimate. So they have opaque databases and they've designed this terminology called a QPA, or qualifying payment amount. And they said this is actually what our average is in this geography. It's really interesting for certain payers in certain geographies. There's been lawsuits and litigation on this. That offer from them is very curiously close to Medicare.
Mhm.
And what does Medicare pay us, Josh, on the dollar for anesthesia?
What, 13 cents, something like that at this point? About maybe a little bit more at this point, but yeah, and it's so interesting again to see the cyclical change, because a lot of this years ago was state by state legislation. So there were states that said if you're out of network, then the insurer has to pay the group's flat rate, whatever their rate, whatever that number is, which would bring the insurers to the table because they didn't want to pay that full board. There was no language about out of network, whatever the patient would have to make up. There were states that said, and the goal again was to bring the insurer to the table, which was effective, but that there were practices that intentionally, as Mo was saying, would intentionally, just not negotiate in good faith. So there had to be a middle ground, but I think Mo articulated extremely well the big miss in the No Surprises Act.
What impact on practices have you observed? And I understand that even to enter arbitration, one of the challenges is there's like a per arbitration fee that is incumbent upon I think the provider, the physician's practices, to, like, if the insurance company doesn't want to pay us what we're telling them this is worth, and we got to pay $200 to go in front of that arbitrator on a per claim basis, and you multiply that times all the surgeries, that can quickly become a huge expense.
Yeah, so look, let's be honest. There was a publication, ASA supported it in the North Carolina market, for example, with Blue Cross. And Blue Cross had it officially on their documents that they shared internally and externally to practices that says, we are basically taking advantage of the law and we're going to pay you the QPA. And if you don't like it, we're going to terminate you and you can resort to the NSA IDR process. And we're going to take a contract hit on y'all, right? And those contract cuts that they were proposing to these practices were 20-30% cuts,
Mhm.
effective immediately, basically, not waiting till the next contract renewal, but in the middle of their contracts. And this has been used as evidence in some of these cases. So what are these practices forced to do? Scramble. Uh, they have to go through a mechanism and they're not ready for it. They have to collect all this data. They have to file in a certain format. There's a 30-day window for an open negotiation period. There's a filing period that's like 4 days. They have to submit all their evidence and claims. Then they have to wait to get awarded anything, and the insurer still might not pay. 180 days have gone by from start to finish. Your AR has been tied up for 180 days. Your CRNAs have to get paid. Your office staff has to get paid. Your billing company has to get paid. You're not getting paid. And so we've seen a lot of practices fold, take substantial haircuts, go to the hospitals for substantial subsidies, Um, and what have you seen, Josh?
Yeah, no, I would say the same. And I also would go back to a leadership issue when you see the smaller to medium-sized groups. They're not prepared, as most said. You think about the infrastructure that one of the large insurance companies have with analytics and information that, you know, my group is 20 groups, like 20 members, let's say, and I just don't have that ability to have that data in the market or in the state. And I don't have the infrastructure to now, I don't have a team of lawyers sitting in my office. I don't have a team of analytics people in my office. And so those costs go up as well. And that's part of the issue of how do we have effective leadership and scale in some of these smaller groups. And, you know, there's empathetic leaders in hospitals that are going out to the groups and saying, look, we don't want you to fold. We would maybe not want to employ you, but what are your pain points? Tell us about it. There's only certain amount that the groups can, discuss. There can be some NDAs, et cetera. But it's really a David and Goliath situation where the small to medium-sized groups they just don't have the firepower and never will to, if a company's profits are $3 billion a quarter, and, my little group is chugging along, there's just such a power sort of, it just doesn't match. You just can't get to that point.
There was another one that we were chatting about here. It was the slide on the anesthesia death spiral, which was also put in the ASA's workforce document. And this was back from 2023. So I think this sums it up brilliantly. And I've seen this happen to friends and colleagues out there. You've got a services agreement, they want additional coverage, reimbursements falling, higher labor costs. And then sometimes the providers start to leave the group because of that increasing workload and poor reimbursement. And once that happens, the rest of the folks are left behind working even harder, covering more call and getting paid less. And then the group is forced to re-engage with this health system on a huge different ask. And the health system already in a precarious financial state scrambles here. So I'd love to ask Josh the last part of that, of how that kind of falls apart, because I think that's when a lot of times they're called in.
Mm.
And also make a comment around the health system's precarious financial states here, because a lot of times the groups think that, well, those guys have fancy offices,
Mhm.
they should bail us out, and maybe they don't.
Right. I think you're hitting on all the spots. And we'll get called, like I said, we'll get called in generally often by the hospital saying, we don't understand the problem. We don't have the expertise to understand the problem. We're just getting an ask from our anesthesiology group, our radiology group, like I said. And the death spiral is almost irreversible when it gets to the point where you start losing your docs or your CRNAs, because now you're bringing locums in. Say your doc locum is, say, 450 an hour. Your CRNA locum can easily be 300 an hour. Those are huge numbers versus an employed model. And so it gets worse and worse and worse until the group basically collapses under the weight of the costs, and the employed docs and nurses that want to make a go of it at some point just burn out because they're working so much. And that's when it becomes critical often. So to Mo's point, a lot of times these groups think, okay, we're going to hold on, we're going to make this work. And then all of a sudden we can't do it anymore. And now we don't have the staff. We have, 40% locums. And we're going to the hospital saying we can't afford this. It also, again, goes back to how are we staffing and scheduling? Aside from, white space, prime time utilization, what does the staffing model look like? Are we using the right staff in the right location? And this is maybe a bigger question, but how are we using anesthesiology resources? Do we need an anesthesiologist or a CRNA doing cataracts. I mean, we still see that in places, right? So there are a lot of big, broader questions. There's all the financial analysis and metrics, but then there's also the clinical utilization analysis that again, the hospitals don't begin to understand how to do that.
There's a lot of sort of layers to these challenges. Some of them are sort of the secular trends, some of them are specific to states or different sites, types of sites of service. A lot of the listeners for this program are doctors just trying to do their jobs.
Mhm.
So as we think about physicians vetting opportunities, vetting groups, understanding these factors and how it may influence a specific role, how it may influence a career trajectory, what types of questions would you encourage physicians to ask to understand how a lot of these trends are manifest in their market with the hospital, with the group that they may be interviewing, and to be at least going in, maybe you can't do anything about it, but at least going in with eyes wide open and building your life accordingly.
I can lead and then I'll Josh chime in. I think, when I was a resident, I created a little handbook for my peers at the time and about, what to look for in private practice and other opportunities. And I would certainly look at the financial solvency of that practice. Um, and now I would probably rank number one or number two, the relationship with the hospitals. Do you have a deeply embedded group? When I joined my practice, I looked at that and I saw that um, the partners there were surgical service line co-chairs or directors. They were med staff leaders. They were previously on the board of the hospital.
Mhm.
They had incredibly deep ties to the hospital leadership, collaborative relationship with surgical services directors, and of course, surgeons. And that's more and more key because the hospital is going to be, in many respects, a significant funding source and a payer
Mhm.
for your practice now, until this potentially turns around in the next number of years. And that's not unreasonable to expect that there could be a change in the winds here, right? The No Surprises Act could get fixed. The uh, enforcement mechanisms could be changed favorably. The payers could potentially perceive um, this is not worth it anymore and go find some other low-hanging fruit to to take advantage of. They're getting tremendous backlash and reputational damage.
Mhm.
Um, I think governance, leadership, the hospital relations, financial solvency, and then amongst your peers in that practice, obviously equality, um, opportunities to lead there. Do folks get overwhelmingly made partner or have some opportunity to lead that practice? That was a huge tenet of my practice when I joined. Um, the year you were made partner, theoretically, you could be voted even onto the board. There was no restrictions on that, and nobody could be president for more than two terms. So that was very, very attractive. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, you hit on virtually everything. And Justin, you probably don't know, but I have an early career son who's an anesthesiologist. So I've had these exact conversations about what to look for in practice settings. And I think Mo hit really important point about the culture and the fit of the group with the hospital. I go a lot of places where the hospital CMO says, my anesthesiology group are just a bunch of locker slammers, meaning they come in, they do their anesthetics, and when it's their turn to go, they slam their lockers and they're out the door and they don't think about it anymore. You know, be on the bylaws committee, be embedded, be on important committees for the hospital, be the director of the School of Nurse Anesthesia. You really make sure that the hospital understands that your value is beyond the operating room, beyond the perioperative space, the procedural space, that you're a true valued partner. And then the discussions around financial get a little easier because there's comfort and confidence from the hospital that you really are a partner and you really are struggling. I think that to me is the most important part as a young person comes in looking at the culture. I think part of the culture, again, as Mo said, is what does it look like for me to move up to partnership? What does partner mean? Do we have, quote, junior partners and senior partners where really the senior partners continue to have all the power? The junior partners are partner in name. There's a lot of that you have to look at. And not all of it is completely transparent when residents are coming out. And and as Mo said, I mean, he wrote the book. Residents have no idea. I mean, there are people that have been doing this for decades that I don't want to say take advantage necessarily, but they do in a sense. They know what they can get away with. I would say that dynamic also though is changing because the residents are at a premium. Every group needs residents to come out to be, doctors joining their group. But I would say culture and looking at the financial and the internal culture and the culture with the hospital. And by the way, not just with the hospital, but be involved in the community. Be the chairman of the board of the American Heart Association chapter for your hospital, your region. Do these things that you're then recognized as a valuable asset to the hospital.
Another item I've observed related to both culture and the financials is what does turnover look like? And is this a place where the last 3 years have been a revolving door and or we have like a growing percentage of our staff that are locums coverage? That may indicate that there's some challenges that need to be addressed timely before you get beyond the point of no return.
The locums thing is interesting, isn't it? Because, gosh, when we all came out of training and tried to join groups, we looked for all of those things in a great private practice and a partnership track. And increasingly, I see a lot of folks even coming right out of training saying, "I'll take a locum option."
Mhm.
It's lucrative, there's no doubt. It's transient.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be highly fluid.
Mhm.
I worry a few things about the future of our specialty there. And I worry that those folks won't get the mentorship in all of the things that Josh mentioned, how to actually be involved in hospital leadership and the mentorship of governance and running a practice and the business side of that practice. Um, and once you don't have that skill, if you do locums for 5 or 7 years, how are you ever going to get that skill? And then I worry about, or is a good chunk of the profession just going to become clock punchers?
Mhm.
It's lucrative now, but at some point, if that's what all of your work life has been, um, how do you have how do you take control back in practices and a department and a governance? Because the pendulum will swing, right? We just talked about this. We talked about that career trajectory and our peers going from independent practitioners to a group to potentially hospital employment. It's going to swing back.
Mhm.
Who are going to be the leaders to take back and reorganize practices here?
And, not piling on, but, you think about who's going to see the pre-op for the inpatient for the next morning? Well, if I'm a locums and I've got a 8-hour shift, I'm done at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, or whatever. That's going to be somebody else's problem. It the financial models are hurting in my opinion, some of the clinical practices that traditionally, we would see a sick patient on the floor the night before. We don't see that all the time. I saw a contract where the group said for, every inpatient pre-op, we expect a $25 payment to the doctor internally. And these are the kind of things that, we're becoming a transaction specialty. And to Mo's point, I really worry what that's going to look like in 10 or 15 years. I think we're letting go of our professionalism in some ways. That may be a little dramatic, but I think we have to step back and say, we as the physicians have to control some of this environment, including in the hospital leadership, right?
So to that example, right, Josh mentioned earlier in the conversation that he's advised some of these hospitals that their costs are going to go up 25% if they employ because of that clock punching mentality. Now, look, as a private practice group, our group eats what it kills, right? And so when you go to work, and in your first case is not there, you're calling the surgeon, what happened, or calling the pre-op nurse, or can we get the next patient down here? If you're employed and you're going to get paid for your shift, go grab a coffee, right?
Hmm.
Look, the next patient, when they get here, they get here. If there's a gap or a hole in the middle of the day, surgeon satisfaction starts to fall apart, and there starts to become more and more churn at some point, right?
And that also speaks to what's the stipend model? Is it a true up model? Is it, a cost plus model? There's a lot of different stipend models that will affect behavior. When we're looking at OR efficiencies and we see a same day cancellation rate of say 4%, 5%, which is huge. That's a large cancellation rate. You look at the unutilized resources that are sitting around and the cost associated with that. Some of these are just killers, and they can be addressed through more cohesive groups, making sure that the pre-op, the perioperative space, the pre-op clinic, all that is managed and run well, with really tight algorithms around some of this. A lot of doctors that are, employed they're not that interested in doing that extra work. They're not that interested in, say, building out a surgical home or an ERAS program. There's no quote upside in it for them.
Yeah, this is one of those complex. I wonder, I talk to a lot of these like 35 to 45-year-old docs who based on my limited anecdotal experience, but I've had a lot of these conversations, like they are not going to work until they're 68 years old. They are
Mhm.
looking for an off ramp.
Okay.
And it's either because the kids just don't know how to work anymore like they used to, or it's because the economic trade has gotten less favorable over time, or because the job description has evolved or expanded in ways that they feel like this isn't what I signed up for. And I've heard all of those in different permutations. But I mean, I share all these concerns from the conversations that I have because the young docs who like we hope are going to carry that baton, they don't seem like they want to carry it that long, many of them. And a lot of the work I try to do, obviously, is to equip them, like financially, to be robust and have that moat so that they can
Mhm.
not be economically stressed. But there is the realities of like, I can't save you from the clinical and operational demands of your job. And it still seems to be pretty corrosive in many settings.
Yeah, and I would say that most physicians truly don't go into it for the money. There's a compassion component, there's a caring component. Um, but a lot of the younger doctors want to be in a situation where they do this work because they want to on their own terms, not because they have to at 60 years old. And so all of these things we're talking about, I mean, Mo brought up really a lot of important points. All the financial points affect how physicians are looking at their world. Most of them want to do it because they're mission driven, but the financial hurdles are changing how they're looking at the profession, and it's really disruptive. By the way, it's not just anesthesiologists. We could have this hour conversation about radiologists, about
Yep.
emergency room physicians, hospitalists, ICU doc. It's really pervasive throughout medicine, which is really worrying. To your point.
The kids that don't want to do it anymore, that's an interesting one because I've fallen into that sometimes, I guess, is like our old curmudgeons here. But why? We signed up for that junk.
Right.
You heard it, Josh signed up for it at 125 grand and he worked his tail off 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. How come these guys don't want to sign up for 50 hours a week at 500 grand? I think more than anything else, I was sitting next to a hospital executive um, at a meeting, and he was also scratching his head. And I said, it's a loss of agency, loss of control and agency, and employment ain't going to make that better.
Yep. Totally
It's
agree.
not going to solve that issue. And um, I'm going to stay till the end of, till the night if it's my practice. And when it's not my practice, whether I'm a locum or I'm employed, or I've been so disincentivized where even if it is my practice, it's not my practice because I do what you tell me. I show up when you tell me. I cover the rooms you tell me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and that loss of agency, loss of respect, and then I'm not going to want to show up. It's interesting. I had one more thing to touch on, and I think just we talk about landscape here. This was a slide I'd put together for another talk, and you know, massive impacts across certain geographies and health systems, right? Big health systems across multiple hospitals across states, and they've all had significant challenges. All of these have been in the news, in anesthesiology news, and others and Becker's and their turnover for anesthesia, systems imploding, sudden employment, um, a conversion from an independent group or several independent groups to some other model, and then the groups in that were impacted, and many of these don't exist anymore as independent groups, or have been significantly hit or carved up or broken apart. And Josh knows a lot of these folks. I know a lot of these folks. I did want a quick comment there around that and see what Josh's thoughts are there.
Yeah, no, again, I think we're saying a lot of these financial metrics that we've been talking about and demographics. Um, it's very disruptive to the individual physicians because when a lot of these things happen, we can go down and have the whole conversation around what non-competes look like within groups. You know, if this group is holding on to one little piece, can they enforce the non-compete for the bigger practice? It's very disruptive because physicians oftentimes, because of the all of the turmoil that occurs, may have to leave the city, or they may have a large buyout from their group to stay. And you know, I'm an individual physician, and my buyout's 150 or $200,000. I have to evaluate the value of paying that to stay in town. But physicians generally tend to be, you know, based in their community, and so this is very disruptive on a personal level. And we see, well, I know you see it all over too, but we see physicians having to pick up their family and move completely to different areas to practice the medicine that they want to practice.
Yeah, non-competes is another hour-long talk we could have
Yes, it
alone,
is.
right?
Yeah.
But a quick summary there is that it's protective of an individual to a degree, right? I'm sorry, it's protective of the group. If the group has a non-compete and the hospital decides to employ, right, you have to buy that out. There's some monetary value, or there's leverage by those clinicians. Individual physicians would rather not have non-competes and be flexible and go where they want. In many of those circumstances, the trend has been if a takeover occurs and is imminent and is not on favorable terms to the clinicians, well, I get to leave, or they've turned themselves into locums divisions and locum themselves back in that geography. And I know that's happened in Portland, in Chicago to a great degree, in several other significant geographies where it's happened widely in that metropolitan area because of a big shakeup with one or two big health systems. What are your thoughts there, Josh?
No, I think that's exactly right. And I also think that a little bit tangentially, but we go back to what does staffing look like? What are we going to break medical direction and go 8 to 1 or 10 to 1 in an ASC? What are the things that we are going to be able to do as a group to survive? And what are the clinical implications? Where does that make sense? Where does it not make sense? We have a CRNA taking OB call all night long. I mean, this also goes into the entire financial picture and part of the modeling.
So when this occurs and one of these hospital systems and the group relationship completely collapses, we've literally seen this, a six, seven, $8 million subsidy turns into a $20 million turnover cost for just 1 year as that hospital takes that over. Their knee-jerk response is you've got to do 8 to 1 or 6 to 1 or something like that to make this solvent. The funny thing is, I've seen this. Oregon, I think, is a good example. Chicago and others have been good examples where that group originally didn't even want to do care team at all.
Right, exactly.
And had they only thought a little bit outside the box, look, this is going to get, challenging, I think, to some folks. But just because you learned it one way in residency doesn't mean that's the way you practice today, right? I was tapped to lead the startup of a liver transplant program in our community hospital. Of course, our instinctive response was no blank way, right? And guess what? 5 years in, we hit number one survival statistics for any hospital in the country for that time. You can do this. It's hard, but you're some of the most educated, highly trained folks in the country. You tell me you can't safely supervise any CRNAs? Well, the hospital's going to say, we need a change.
Yeah, and anecdotal story like that along those lines. We were involved in contract negotiations with a large, sophisticated hospital in Washington State. And the anesthesiologists were saying, no, we're at one of their community hospitals. No, we're MD only. That's the only way we're going to do it. And we modeled out the financial implications. And then I said, let's think about this. If we're covering, it's 12 rooms in this community hospital, your patients are ASA ones and twos, all the complex stuff is going to the main, the flagship hospital. Let's look at that. And maybe as part of the concession in the contract, you say, we're going to change our model from MD only to medical direction with the possibility of going to medical supervision down the road. So you got 12 ORs, you're going to go 1 to 4. We may go 1 to 6 in 2 or 3 years as we see how this plays out. The groups have to be creative in finding solutions. It's not just we need this amount of money, but how can we again partner with the hospital to find creative solutions?
And nobody's saying that that's where you need to be or that's where it has to go. But the folks that are saying, I can't even do 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, is going to lead to disastrous consequences. As a matter of fact, the other thing that we've seen out there, both of us, is independent CRNA groups without any doctors getting more and more traction from these hospitals. So, what's the best thing for American healthcare and for our patients in this country? You being disintermediated from that situation, or are you figuring out how to provide healthcare? Because I know you can do it because you go to third world countries to do mission trips and you can do amazing things. You could start a liver transplant program in a community hospital. You can do amazing things. You could start a residency program like my practice did in a community setting. We partnered with an AA school and provide training there and a CRNA school. So you're top of your class in elementary school, you were top of your class in high school, you were top of your class in college, you nailed the MCAT, you got into medical school, you were probably top of the class in med school to get into an anesthesia program. And many of you all graduated from very prestigious programs and fellowships. And you're sitting there doing a carpal tunnel, right? So you got a fighter jet pilot, you know, doing a Bahamas air tour. Like, okay, guys, let's start to think outside the box here and practice at the top of our license. Because I get triggered when they say when I have other folks practice at the top of their license. How about me practicing at the top of my license and the skill set that I bring to the table?
And I think adding to that, top of your license is clinical top of your license. Also, it's got to be business top of your license. We're all smart people. As Mo said, we all probably did well to get into medical school, into anesthesiology. What are we doing to expand our knowledge of the business environment? And I would challenge people listening to this podcast to think about the business aspects and really get involved and dig into it, get an understanding, get your MBA maybe, do things that will help you understand the evolving landscape because it's going to continue to change. We've seen it change over the last 30 years, over the last, probably longer than that, but it's not going to stop changing. But what are the tools we're going to have beyond the ability to do a double lumen tube? What are the tools we're going to have on the business side to help mitigate risk in the changing environment?
So as we're getting towards the end of the hour here, I think I started off this thing by saying the hellscape of anesthesia, it's out there. But you know what else is out there is some really tremendous success stories. Hospitals that are doing creative things with their anesthesia groups. We recently did a joint venture with an academic institution, and it's so far gone very swimmingly well, partnering with the independent anesthesia group, the academic side, covering a pain point for them in what was perceived as challenging coverage areas and having a governance model that's really working well for all parties. Transparency financially. which the mothership really needed, and autonomy that the independent group really needed. And I think there's some novel opportunities in that perspective. And then I see independent groups that have continued to survive and do well in this environment, that have not just negotiated on dollars, but come to comprehensive, good negotiations around coverage, quality, outcomes. Do you have an example of that particularly, Josh?
Yeah, I have multiple where I'm obviously not going to name any of them, but yeah, where the group has had the foresight to 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 really demonstrate, that quality. And, to your point about the landscape change as well, though, there was a I don't know, gold rush in the, mid 2000s to 2019, 2015, something like that, where the thought was, oh, the bigger we get, regionally or nationally, the more control we will have. There was a lot of senior partners and groups that made a lot of money. The reality is, the larger groups actually offer more sophistication. And I'm not speaking. I'm agnostic to all the different groups. I don't. But there's a lot of sophistication there. There's a lot of leadership there. But ultimately, the business aspects are all local, because whatever the group looks like, it's dealing with one hospital or one system. So we say all politics are local, all anesthesiology is local, but there are structures out there that may give some sophistication to what we do.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Dr. Miller, Dr. Azam, thank you very much for joining us. I learned a ton. I love these conversations because I can talk to super smart people and learn about what's going on out there. So this has been a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.